We appreciate you being with us today. On behalf of the UT College of Liberal Arts Development Office and Public Affairs teams, I'd like to welcome you to On Course with Liberal Arts, where we are proud to showcase the college's outstanding research and teaching. Today's topic is On Walls, Fences, and a Bridge, How Regimes Establish Boundaries. It's my honor to introduce you to our expert speaker, Dr. Thomas Garza. Dr. Garza is a UT Regents and University Distinguished Teaching Associate Professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and the Director of the Liberal Arts Texas Language Center. He's also affiliated faculty in the program in Comparative Literature and the Center for Mexican American Studies. During his 30-year tenure at the university, he's received numerous prizes for undergraduate and graduate teaching, including the Texas Excellence Award, the President's Associates Award, and the Harry Ransom Award. He was inducted into the University Academy of Distinguished Teachers in 2003, selected for a Regents Outstanding Teaching Award in 2009, and was named to the Texas 10 by the Texas X's in 2018. If you have questions for Dr. Garza throughout the talk, please type those into the chat function. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the last half of the webinar. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Garza.
Thank you so much, Angie. I so appreciate that generous introduction. Let me just set up my slides here. So good afternoon, everyone. As Angie said, I'm Tom Garza. I'm an associate professor in the Slavic and Eurasian Studies Department and also the director of the Texas Language Center. In spite of my name and my pedigree, improbably, I've been traveling to and working in Russia since 1979, my first trip during the days of the Soviet Union, back when I was still an undergraduate. I also worked at the Foreign Service Institute in the second half of the 1980s in Washington, D.C., during those very years when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and even the beginnings of the time that began the process of the end of the Soviet Union and what seemed to be the end of the Cold War that had marked almost all of my first 30 years of life up to that point. But since the election of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the year 2000, the rise of increasingly nationalistic movements globally has rekindled the political, emotional import of these installments like the Berlin Wall did in 1961. And so what I'd like to do for the next half hour before your questions and comments is to talk with you today, returning to the Berlin Wall as a kind of source, an archetype, if you will, of the kind of barrier that was used by a repressive regime to establish dominance and control of a perceived threat to their authority. And so I want to start with something a little different. As I was preparing these comments for this afternoon's talk with you, I was reminded very much of a 1914 poem by Pulitzer Prize-winning American poet Robert Frost called Mending Walls, so written during the time, 1914, that the world was preparing to go to war, and notions of what is a nation, what constitutes a nation, and what are borders was paramount in many, many minds at the time, especially in Europe. But Frost uses this neighborly conflict in the longer poem to suggest that the building of walls may not be the best solution for good neighbors to exist. And I pulled one stanza out that I like in particular and that has particular relevance, I think, to the rest of my comments today. And Frost wrote, "Before I build a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down." I really love this sentiment of, if indeed it is that good walls make good neighbors, Frost is taking issue with this notion of saying building a wall also by necessity means someone is on one side of the wall while someone else is on the other side. And the question then is begged, who is being walled out and who's being walled in? So if you're of my generation, this Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, might be a good metaphor for us to start with. But if you're not of the generation of the boomers, someone a little bit younger, of the millennials or even Gen Z, maybe something from 2018's blockbuster film Black Panther might be more to your taste. And this is, of course, also came to my mind because of the very recent and sudden death of actor Chadwick Boseman, who plays the film's titular hero, T'Challa, the Black Panther. Though his words may seem a bit platitudinous, they do tend to resonate very well in the current environment in 2020. So in troubled times, wise men build bridges while fools build walls, so said the Black Panther a couple of years ago. However, I want to put forward today a slightly different proposition. In the age of Putin and Trump, bridges and walls, and indeed a particular bridge, have become tools of divisiveness and new nationalism, expanding on cultural critic Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined communities and transgressions of borders that encompass nationalist movements, something that the 21st century is already seeing in its first 20 years. And so as we think back, just last year, 2019 was the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in November. We were reminded, again, those of us of my generation, of the very painful modern history, the second half of the 20th century, of dividing communities for ideological agendas and political gains. And so I want us, as we step into the 21st century, to think of these borders, both imagined and real, as what they mean, what they meant in 1961 and what they mean now. Throwing in front of you a few images from the early 1960s of the Berlin Wall. And interestingly, the wall itself, though visible in every one of these images that I've put up, it almost takes a secondary position to the faces of the individuals that have been separated by the Berlin Wall. And that's precisely where I want us to begin in what makes the border real to people, is when the edifice stands there and you realize that you're on one side or the other of it. So for anyone of my generation, the Berlin Wall was not only a symbol of an authoritarian regime's very willful repression of fellow human beings' rights and freedoms, but also a very real physical edifice, a physical site of human tragedy, of separation, and even murder. Indeed, the careful chronicling of individuals trying to escape over the Berlin Wall or under the Berlin Wall became a kind of global leitmotif of human struggle throughout the second half of the 20th century. So what can we learn, or what have we learned from the Berlin Wall in the 30 years of its existence? If we return to the anniversary of the fall of the wall itself in just last year, what have we learned in those 30 years since the fall regarding the construction of real edifices on imagined borders? In the case of the wall, the transgressions that we witnessed occurred both during and after its construction. But have we since fully understood the inherent contradiction between the erection of barriers and the human reflex to express their free will? So I want to turn now for the remainder of this talk to two contemporary examples of building ideologically infused structures whose function it is to delineate a border and reimagines the paradox that the Berlin Wall put up for us, but in two very disparate settings. So I'll talk about this tale of two borders in 2020. In Russia, Mr. Putin's Crimea Bridge, and in the US, between the United States and Mexico, Mr. Trump's border wall. In the current period of toxic politics and exclusionism in global affairs, two projects, the two in front of you, have been emphasized for their similarities between bridges and walls. So if we think back to what T'Challa was saying about don't build walls, build bridges, here we have a case where a wall is once again playing the divisive structure, but also now in the 21st century, a bridge can have that same effect. Putin's bridge linking Russia's mainland and the recently annexed Crimean Peninsula opened in May of 2018, becoming the longest bridge in Europe. The wall, as it's been called on the US-Mexico border, was actually begun as a series of dividers in 2006 by George W. Bush and continued through the Obama administration, but then became highly politicized into an election rally cry and a promise of current President Donald Trump. So let's take a look at the two in unison and then individually. So I'm looking on bridges and walls. Both edifices, the Crimea Bridge and the US-Mexican Wall, not only permit, but in many ways encourage a kind of transgression, crossing the border, both real, physically going across from one side to the other, and imagine what would it be like to be on the other side as part of their viability. What am I saying here? These edifices don't exist if people don't imagine themselves being on one side or the other. And if they're, whichever side they're on, thinking about what it must be like on the other side. In both cases, the Crimea Bridge and the US border wall, transgression is viewed as such only on one side of the imagined border. That is, you're only breaking the law going one way. I'll let you think about what that means. Is it going from Russia into Ukraine or from Ukraine into Russia? In the case of the Crimea Bridge, now that Crimea is part of Russia, who really then is breaking the law, a Russian or Ukrainian? For the border wall, is it Mexicans coming to the US or US Americans crossing over into Mexico that are viewed as the transgressor? At least historically, it's the case that only one side has been the transgressor. The territory of Crimea was claimed by both Ukraine and Russia for many, many decades and was home to citizens of both countries. The US-Mexican border, once much further north in the current than the current border is into the United States, now is home in what loosely has been called by former UT professor Jose Limon, Greater Mexico, to residents of both the United States and Mexico. So now let's take a closer look at the two of these edifices in a bit more detail. First, the Crimean Bridge. So both projects, both the wall and the bridge, are also problematic in their physical terms. That is, the Crimea Bridge actually spans two contested waterways, the Black Sea. Let me get my cursor here down below. Any of you, again, who are World War buffs, that is, in looking at the history of the two world wars, know that especially in World War II, who claims dominance to the Black Sea and its egress from the Asian continent over into the European continent has lots of not just political clout, but also a great deal of military clout. To a lesser extent, just to the north of this Strait of Kerch is the Sea of Azov, which also now links by water the Russian mainland with Ukraine, also very contested border. So we've got not just the physical difficulty of building a bridge that goes across a strait of water, but it actually is being built between contested bodies of water and onto a contested peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula. In an interestingly similar way, the building of the wall has its roots as well in US-Mexican history here. Trump's 2,000-mile border wall is both materially and fiscally nearly impossible to construct, but as is, was either already in place before Trump's election in 2016, or is unnecessary due to the long natural border of the Rio Grande River along the US-Texas border. And while the US-Mexican border, both drawn and natural, has long been established, its permeable nature, the fact that citizens of both sides move back and forth with relative ease between the two countries, has been known as Greater Mexico, as I mentioned earlier, extending well into the US South, into California, and into Texas. Has been part of the cultural, socio, and economic well-being of this region for more than a century. Even President George W. Bush knew that the idea of sealing off the US-Mexican border would spell economic disaster in most of these Southwest regions, California and Mexico, because of the free movement, or relatively free movement of individuals between the two countries. So what was the US's response to this Crimea project. I'm going to keep ping-ponging between the two projects to give you a sense of what both went on and, in a sense, continues to present day to be happening in Russia, Crimea, and along the US-Mexican border. So I want to focus first on the construction of Vladimir Putin's Crimea Bridge and the inherent problems there are in this seemingly positive connotation of building a bridge at face value. I'll go back to T'Challa's words, right? That linking the Russian mainland with the Crimean Peninsula would ostensibly be making it easier for people to move back and forth. But what's the inherent problem here is that the bridge being built actually is an emphasis of the fact that Ukraine has now been, in a sense, exiled from the peninsula to which it once claimed ownership. And indeed, now for a Ukrainian to get into the Crimean Peninsula, a visa must be issued to all Ukrainian citizens wanting to come over, whereas Russians now can travel freely across the newly constructed bridge from the Russian mainland into Crimea, which again once was part of the Ukraine mainland, now is part of the Russian mainland thanks to the building of this bridge. So when it first began to be proposed, much less constructed, in 2015, this was just 1 year after its annexation. In 2014, the US Department of State, this is still under President Obama, issued the following statement: "The bridge represents not only an attempt by Russia to solidify its unlawful seizure and its occupation of Crimea, but it also impedes navigation by limiting the size of ships that can transit the Kerch Strait, and the only path to reach Ukraine's territorial waters in the Sea of Azov." And so it's a fairly measured response in that the US objects to its building in pragmatic, practical terms. Let's look at the wall in similar terms. I'm going to make one last comment of the Russian response to that statement. In fact, so the same year in 2015 that the United States State Department issued that statement stating its objection to the building of the Crimea Bridge, Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs issued the following statement: "Until now, Crimea's 2.3 million citizens have been largely cut off from the rest of the world." The implication here is a problematic one because, of course, movement onto the Ukraine mainland had always been no problem. There was a direct land link between Crimea and Ukraine. "The territory has been accessible by plane or ferry from Russia. Only by plane or ferry could you get to Crimea from Russia. And the Ukrainian government has blocked most road and rail traffic to the occupied region between 2014 and 2018. So in 2018, when the bridge opened, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs releases this statement so that it becomes clear to the rest of the world that the opening of this bridge was a necessity, and a stated and unstated necessity that required for citizens of Russia to get into their own territory now of Crimea, the building of such a bridge. So I want to make just a quick little lyric digression here. How did Russian pop culture respond to the opening of this bridge? I take us to a rather unusual group. So even for among younger Russians, the views of the creation of a real border between two imagined communities. Who lives on the Russian mainland? Well, that's clearly mostly Russians. Who lives on the peninsula of Crimea? Well, until 2014, some Russians lived there, a large number of Ukrainians lived there, and other nationalities would move back and forth via Ukraine to get to the Crimean Peninsula. But now, with the new Crimea Bridge, there's a very different understanding of what that peninsula really means. So one project that was undertaken in 2014, right after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, was from an all-female post-punk band from Novosibirsk called Pathologia in Russian. They took one of their own songs from the year 2000 and re-scripted it, gave it new words, new lyrics to make it more applicable to the new 2014 reality of Russia owning, as it were, the Crimean Peninsula. So the piece is called "I'm Insane, I'm Mad," "Я псих." Again, penned in 2014. It was actually penned in 2000, I should say. It was quite a hit, actually, in the year 2000. But now with these new lyrics, it once again became a kind of rallying cry for young Russians who were actually against the Russian annexation of Ukraine. So if you look at just a couple of the lyrics here, I break all the barriers, I tear down walls, I burn bridges, I tear them, take them apart to the foundation, a world of soulless emptiness. Let me go down a little further here. I don't believe in your truth. I'm fine, I'm healthy. I just really stand out from, and in the Russian lyrics, you see this, from all those Moscow fools. I'm mad, but the walls are soft, soft walls. And so the doctors tell me that I'm mad, and scream, don't scream. I love this little bit of lyric, as I said, literally a lyric digression here of looking at these lyrics that made clear the message of encountering barriers and losing one's mind, this kind of link of I've lost the freedom of moving between one side of a barrier to another because you've put the barrier there. And the response to both acts, if you will, is to tear down both walls and bridges. Again, this group decided that bridges were equally in the 21st century as destructive as walls. So finally, I'd like to provide two of the most recent iterations of this building of barriers, walls and bridges in our two countries, Russia and the US, something that's going to resonate a little bit more in a contemporary way, even than the border wall or the Crimea Bridge did, to look at the creation of two very evocative structures in the two countries. So first, let's take a look at Mr. Putins Moscow once again. This particular structure is located right in the heart of Moscow, just a stone's throw from Red Square and the Kremlin itself. It's Putin's domestic take, if you will, on the bridge. It's Moscow's urban park, located, for some of you who may have traveled to Russia, to the Soviet Union back in those days of the Soviet period, where that large hotel Rossiya, the Rossiya Hotel, used to stand. The hotel was raised over a decade ago, and in its place, this park called Zaradia has been put in its place. One of the features, the kind of attractions of this park, is this so-called bridge to nowhere, a pedestrian bridge that takes you onto and over the Moscow River that divides the two sides of Moscow, takes you over the river with the illusion as though you're crossing over to the other side. But just as you have that sensation that you are now at the point of no return, crossing a border, as it were, it brings you back to the very point from which you started. There is no transgression here. Rather, the passenger, if you will, feels safe in moving from this one side of Moscow, seemingly about to get to the other side, and then making the U-turn back around. So it's literally is a bridge to nowhere, because it brings you right back to where you started, but in many respects gives a safe version of a bridge, in contrast to the one Mr. Putin built in Crimea. In our own country, will take us to a little bit closer to home in Washington, D.C. So back in the U.S. this past spring, as you all are fully aware, the nation struggled with not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but also we were confronted as a country, as a people, with the realities of systemic racism in the United States through the Black Lives Matter movement and associated calls for solidarity with that movement. Possibly the most memorable movement of the multi-city protests that occurred during this past spring and well into the summer was the forced removal of peaceful protesters near the White House in Washington, and the subsequent erection of a second fence. Remember, there already is an iron fence that protects the grounds of the White House itself and has been there for decades upon decades, but a second fence constructed outside the existing fence around the White House. My contention here is that the People's House, as it has frequently been called, the White House, the People's House, was now on the other side of a double border between us and them. And as Robert Frost mentions in that very beginning, think about who is us and who is them. That's a question that each of you will have to decide on your own. But I really want to leave you with a final return to the Berlin Wall and this current edifice of a second fence in the White House, to two images, one from Berlin in the 1960s and one from just a month and a half ago in Washington, D.C. in 2020. The striking similarity between the images from 1960s Berlin Wall confrontations between East Berlin police and protesters and the police in 2020 with the White House Lafayette Park police reminds us of how symbolic the erection of a wall, in this case a fence, especially in a democratic society, can be. And it forces us to reconsider the effectiveness of these structures, to protect, to defend. Is that really what they're doing? And protect who from whom, and defend what from what? Rather, perhaps what they do is call us to recall and ponder the words that I began this talk with today of Robert Frost in his poem, and ask ourselves critically, what are we walling in or walling out? And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I open it up to questions, comment, and discussion, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks so much.
We do have a question. Have
Please.
You had a chance to talk with Russians about the Crimean Bridge? And if so, what is the general consensus?
I have. The first part of the question, I've definitely had a chance to talk to quite a number of my colleagues. And my colleagues, my wife and I go back at least twice a year. Well, before COVID we did anyway, but we love going back, both in the summer with a group of our UT students and in the winter for our own research projects. So my group of that were native informants is varied. A lot of them are university educators, so also professors, mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but a lot of them are also, one would probably call more of, not of the intelligentsia. They're not, they don't have university educations, and really do, and in my sense, the two sides represent a good cross-section of at least urban Russians' views on that very, very good question that you asked. So most of my university colleagues were opposed to the building, they were opposed to the annexation of Crimea to begin with, and were opposed to the building of the bridge. But a lot of Russians, quite a number of Russians, not only thought it was, like in the old 19th century US conception of eminent domain, that it was Russia's right to have that territory be part of the Russian mainland and to be connected to it. So Russians are to present day, very split on this issue. And if you remember 2014 at all, the news coverage from downtown Moscow, Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, the major cities in Russia, had demonstrations that were both in favor of the war on Ukraine and very much against the war on Ukraine, especially Russians of my generation were very much opposed to it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can you imagine a scenario whereby either of the barriers you examine here gets dismantled in 20 to 30 years, like the Berlin Wall was?
I'm hoping in the case, I'll start with what I hope is the easier of the two cases, which is the second fence in Lafayette Park around the White House, which I hope it was erected with under the pretense, again, as I mentioned in my talk, there's always the pretense of defense as protection and defense as a reason that these barriers need to be created. So if I go with that idea that it was all about protection, then hopefully as the situation of protests quiets a bit, although we're not seeing a lot of signs that in many of our major cities, protest on both sides is quieting at all. But if and when that protest quiets, that the Lafayette Park fence would be taken down, that it's still being considered a temporary barrier. The Crimea Bridge, however, I don't think is coming down on its own. It really would have to be forcibly dismantled, and Mr. Putin certainly has no intention of stepping down as president or not running again for another term of president of Russia, at least in the foreseeable future. So that one, at least in my lifetime, I think is there to stay, the Crimea Bridge, that is.
What does your research suggest about long-term or even short-term about reconciliation between citizens on both sides?
So is this for the Russia-Ukraine conflict in particular?
She was in particular, so perhaps both.
I'll be happy. I've on both. My scholarship is actually, as I said at the beginning, even though my name is Tomás Garza, my scholarship, with the exception of working on gender studies, is mostly focused on Russia and former Soviet states. The relationship between let me preface this with, I was incredibly startled by the antipathy, the bad feeling, the ill will that began to grow in the second decade of the 2000s between Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have been, along with Belarus, actually part of a kind of greater so-called white Russia, Belarus, literally meaning white Russia, kind of greater Slavdom of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia forming this seemingly unbreakable alliance of well over 1,000 years of history. So I was very surprised when this antipathy started in around 2010 between Russia and Ukraine, and ultimately ended in 2014 with near civil war in Ukraine, and certainly more than a border skirmish between Ukraine and Russia, nearly a hot war between the two. So that feeling, bad will between the two countries, I'm hopeful, because of the longer history of good relations between the two and the common Slavic blood between the two sides, that ill will quiet in the next, I don't know if it's going to be soon, I don't think it will be very soon, but certainly in the next decade or so, we might see that. Now, between the U.S. and the US-Mexico border, my answer is going to be much more anecdotal. I'll turn to my 88-year-old mother. I don't think she minds me giving her age. I think she's rather proud of it at this point, actually. Very upset, actually, with the COVID restrictions in particular, but the new structures along the wall. She and her husband used to make certainly my childhood, my father and mom and all of us used to cross the border all the time back in the 60s, 70s. But she used to regularly have her hair done and go there to Mexico to buy medicines and have Sunday lunch and things like that. So she's very, very sad to see the border become less permeable between the two sides, and having Mexicans coming to our side, and for American citizens crossing over to the U.S. citizens crossing over to the Mexican side. I really, really hope that the insistence on a physical structure between the U.S.-Mexican border is political, and that eventually, in our own, as it were, deeper examination of free will, that we see the permeable border as being, which has been in place, as it were, for the last 100 plus years, since the 1830s, is the right way to go, of allowing both sides to move with relative ease, still obviously having border checkpoints and all, but being able to move between our borders more like the European Union establishment is. That's what seems to me to be what we should return to. I hope sooner rather than later. I hope it's sooner than 10 years. Terrific question. Thank
you. So the next question is first a comment and then a question related to the last. I am as critical an opponent of President Trump as you will find, but in a post 9/11 world, all borders were reinforced, and we even need a passport to cross into Canada or visit our Caribbean friends. won't it take a real profound change in the global community, a relaxation of wars and tensions for borders to all come down?
Yes, I always like to just go for the answer to the question. My answer is definitely yes, it will. That said, what we've seen in the 21st century, really beginning, it's almost an embarrassment that it happens in 2000, in March of 2000, when Putin is elected for his first full term as president of Russia. We see this beginning of kind of a neo-nationalism globally. It's not just in the US by any means. Indeed, I would say it tends to have begun in Eurasia and Europe. But we see these movements by certain parts of certain political movements that see the sanctity of the national border as being an implicit part of security. Now, or maybe I should have said explicit part of security. Implicit in that security is that we, within those borders, all think the same way. Now, that's maybe true in some countries, that we're seeing these nationalist movements occurring. I certainly know that's not the case in the United States. It's not actually the case in Russia either. These more heterogeneous countries and civilizations and societies that have differing points of view and very different kinds of human experiences are going to react to a closed border very differently. As I said, the reflex of free will does tend to rise up fairly quickly. So as I said, my reflex answer at the beginning is you're right. There needs to be a change of kind of a world political view. But then I expand on that just to say that hopefully, given that it was only been in the last 20 years that we've seen this rise of neo-nationalism, that we might be able now to see, hopefully in the coming years, if not decades, a decrease in that same nationalism.
And will one of the things that could stall the removal of closed borders be globalization, a fear of globalization, rather?
Well, I'm hoping, in fact, what it might be is a different response rather than fear to globalization. Globalization is, in my view, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's gotten a lot of bad press and very little good press, though there are some positive things of globalization. There's a kind of reflexive response that, oh, that means a McDonald's opening everywhere, and that's a bad thing. It's going to, and I can say this in Moscow terms, it's having Starbucks in Moscow, populating Moscow streets is erasing Russian culture. And to some extent, yes, that is happening. That's the negative side of globalization. But I'm also seeing a kind of response, again, reflex to those kinds of concrete bits of globalization, the appearance of a McDonald's or a Starbucks, with an intense insistence on buying local, new brands of Russian-made products, and kind of a balance, if you will, between these international views of commerce and a local view of commerce. So there is some good to this globalization movement that I don't think we can pull back at this point. I think between the internet virtually and the world traveling the way it did pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID as well, it's very, very hard to roll that one back now, that there is simply a lot of cross-pollination between our cultures now. And I hope we start now to see more of the good that comes with that cross-pollination of preserving inherent local color and culture, while at the same time being able to enjoy and revel and choose to revel in things from other cultures and countries.
Thanks. One of our attendees is asking if Vladimir Putin has said anything about the United States wall, and has Donald Trump said anything about the bridge?
I have, what a terrific question, because it's one I've been asking myself since pretty much 2014, 2015, when 2014, when the project for the Crimea Bridge was first just mentioned. 2015 was when it was actually announced as a project. And since 2016, when Trump began talking about the wall, again, with all caps in a tweet, I have found next to nothing more than a kind of allusion to, but not a direct reference to either leader talking about the other project. I would so love to know what both think of the other, and what do they think is the better alternative? Is building the kind of monitored bridge that requires visas for former residents to have to get back to their own homes, so to speak, seem more imposing than a physical wall between two countries? I simply don't know. I wish I did have the answer to that one.
There are also mental and emotional walls. By tearing down or stopping the physical walls, is that helpful to healing the emotional ones, or is it vice versa?
Brilliant question, just beautifully phrased question. And that goes back to, I only made a quick mention of him at the beginning of the talk because I didn't want to make it too much like one of my graduate seminars and sound a little too academic-y. But I mentioned Benedict Anderson at the beginning, a 20th century cultural critic whose idea was on borders real and imagined, which is, I kept dropping that into my slides here and there, and that yes, there are physical borders where we draw them on maps, but there are also these imaginary borders where we see ourselves as the foreigner or the other in this or that part of the world. This kind of language, by the way, has been very much front and center with the Black Lives Matter movement that we've been seeing this past spring and summer, is feeling like that you don't belong in where you hold your passport, that you're a stranger in your own country. So your point, very well taken. There are very much emotional, psychological walls that exist, borders that exist, that even when the physical barriers are torn down, remain. We've seen the aftermath, if you will, of having the 30 years of the Berlin Wall bisecting, but dividing up in several in quadrants, the city of Berlin, and how difficult it was after the dropping of the wall to rejoin the two parts of the city, not physically, that was the easy part, but to get the citizens of Berlin and international citizens to see it once again as a unified capital. Same true, by the way, of East and West Germany, right? Reuniting the entire country. There was never a physical wall between them, but rather a border. When the border was erased, as it were, there still is this kind of phantom border or phantom pain that exists between the two. We've seen it repeatedly. The Vietnam story had similar kinds of personal narratives in history after Vietnam was reunited after the collapse of South Vietnam during the middle 70s. Terrific question.
There are some small slivers left of the Berlin Wall. Do you see it potentially valuable to leave this as a monument?
I do. I really do. I've been to both the remnant wall in Berlin since its collapse. I was there briefly. In fact, when I was still in the State Department, I was only there once when it was still actually the Berlin Wall in 1988, just the year before it came down. I've been back since it's been brought down, and I've seen the remnant bits. I've also seen three of the parts of the wall that have been erected in various installations around the world. There's a large part of it, actually 3 sections of it that are in Monterey, California at the Defense Language Institute. They have one of the largest sections of the wall on their campus. And it's funny how even out of its context, the walls, say in Monterey, California, still is incredibly evocative of what all it stood for. You look at the physical thickness of it, its height, its impermeability. You look at what's scrawled on it in languages of all the world, global languages all over it, and you realize what it was, almost as you were saying, a kind of scar of a wound from long, long before. In situ, if you're actually in Berlin, it's palpable. It's like the closest thing I've actually felt to standing in front of the Berlin Wall in situ has been Stonehenge, which actually has obvious physical affinities with the Berlin Wall, but this idea of being at a location where a lot of history, painful and otherwise, has gone down. And it's interesting because Stonehenge, for thousands of years, with the Berlin Wall, only 30, and yet those 30 years are incredibly evocative. So yes, I think leaving bits of that, kind of souvenirs, if you will, reminders of what was there before, is incredibly important, not just for the current generation to heal, but for future generations to remember.
Thank you. We've got one last question,
Sure.
and then I'm happy to turn it back over to you if there's anything else you wanted to add. But the last question is there anything we can do? Is there an action call that we can respond to?
In our country, I think, and I purposely, while I knew my own politics couldn't be absent from this presentation, I tried as hard as I could not to simply say this is positive, this is negative, but to give it as this is the situation right now. I'll briefly just simply put out the universal message that's being said in both countries, although in our country I think it has a bit more bite to it, and that is we're just not even 2 months away from a major election. And I think if you, the real mandate on our border wall is going to be part and parcel of our election. If you're opposed to that kind of separation of peoples, then vote. If you're in favor of that kind of separation between peoples, I would give the same advice. But at least in our country, that is the best way to arbitrate these kinds of decisions internationally. In Russia, it's the same thing as to say the response parties have been saying the same thing: get out and vote against Mr. Putin. But again, in the last week with Alexei Navalny's poisoning in an airport in Siberia, we realize still what happens when you speak against Mr. Putin too loudly. Too many cases. We've had cases of Boris Nemtsov back in 2014, murdered on a bridge just across, speaking of bridges again, on a bridge just outside of the Kremlin, and Navalny poisoned just last week. So opposition there is simply a lot tougher. I'm hard pressed to give Russians advice on what to do to show their opposition to the Putin government if they are opposed to it.
Looks like we have one more question.
Great.
Do you worry that this might be mirrored here in the U.S.?
You've caught me out with that question. I'm by nature, my wife simply calls me an optimist, full stop. I like to think of myself as a positivist, but maybe it is just, I'm just optimistic. So my reflex answer would be to say, I would like to say that we will reverse what has happened in the first part of the 21st century, much the way we had to in the first half of the 20th century. If you remember the Roaring Twenties, the gay 90s led into the Roaring Twenties, this period of excess and a period of, I think, some bad decisions internationally led to the Great Depression, which ultimately was a kind of wake-up call to globally for all of us to maybe reconsider how we conducted ourselves as nations. Sadly, that ultimately moves us into the 40s and the Second World War. But I'd like to think instead that we started the 21st century with some kind of fits and starts of how we're viewing ourselves as a community of global peoples, whether you want to call them nations, countries, or however you see borders, and that we're still feeling our way around this newly more globalized world that we live in. The pandemic, by the way, COVID, has made that, really driven that point of how interlaced, interlocked, interrelated all of us are, that we are not, no pun intended here, not immune from each other's affect as a world, not as a nation anymore, but as a world. And so I'm really, really hopeful that instead of seeing these building more and more edifices, whether that you want to call them bridges or walls, that we start to see more movement of peoples and countries between and among each other in the coming decade.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
Well, I think thank you so much for the chance to get to talk about this subject of I think is timely at the moment of walls and bridges, and I'm so delighted to have gotten some of you giving up some of your valuable time this afternoon to have this conversation together. I would only hope, maybe, and I don't want to say hope against hope. Here's where my optimist side will really show up. Is, if nothing else, the 24-hour news feed that I think has tired so many of us, especially in an election year, should remind us nonetheless of how important what's going on around the world really is. I think isolationism, whether you want to think about it in terms of wall building or the bridges to nowhere, push that to one side. Simply the idea of living in one's own bubble. COVID notwithstanding, but living in one's own bubble, ignoring all that's going on out there, is simply incredibly wrong-headed in any time, but especially in the 21st century, as we really need more to understand what's happening in other countries, continents, and peoples around the world. So I'm so grateful to being part of the University of Texas and College of Liberal Arts family that encourages these kinds of discussion and integrates them with what's happening in our local and now virtual community to be able to talk about them. So with that, I'll leave that as my kind of parting shot for this afternoon.
Thank you. We so appreciate that. We're glad you're a part of the college as well. And we appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us as well. You really do embody the idea that what starts here changes the world.